In a medieval battle, was it possible to cleave through a helmet with a sword? I think considering the available evidence, we'd have to say, ah! I'm just gonna leave this here so you don't forget the mantra. So recently I put up a short video about how the trope of slicing through armor is older than movies, anime, and video games, and sparked some discussion that's interesting to delve into a little bit more. Alright, so we have medieval paintings depicting swords going straight through helmets and armor and all that. The problem with those, of course, is people could draw whatever the heck they wanted, and they sure did. There's some weird stuff.
Monty Python and the Holy Grail parodied the medieval art style, and really the Beast of Arr wouldn't look out of place in some of these paintings. Speaking of which, my personal Beast of Arr has been YouTube's algorithm, and if you want to join the resistance against its oppressive whims, it's as simple as, engaging with the video, and making sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. Maybe binge watch my other stuff too while you're at it, I don't know. Anyway, I find mythical monsters more believable than a fully armored knight getting sliced in half. Which is still more believable than Home Depot selling swords. No, I know, that's not a sword, okay? Wait, this appalling sword-like object is a bestseller? I have failed.
It would be easy enough to dismiss some scribblings if they all showed ridiculous stuff, right? But we also have some highly detailed portrayals of arms and armor that are verified by archaeology and written sources. If it was all a bunch of LARPing fools drawing battle scenes they've never seen, we would expect a lot more inaccuracies. Just think of how modern artists, non-martial artists, depict fighting in arms and armor.
What I find particularly intriguing is this image from Italy, 1370 to 1380. I couldn't find any info about the artist, but whoever it was clearly was very familiar with the arms and armor of the time, and I would argue even likely used them. Particularly looking at this here, the finger over the guard, that's not something that a lay person would know. And when we look at some of the other detail here, like the red lining on the inside, the way the hourglass gauntlet is shaped in general, the clothing, the horses that actually look like horses and all their equipment drawn accurately. This is such a high level of detail. It ventures into Renaissance quality of realistic depictions, which makes sense because the Renaissance is often said to have its origins in Italy as early as the 14th century. Anyway, this manuscript is full of highly detailed, accurate imagery. So I have to wonder, why draw everything so realistically, but then include something as implausible as cutting straight into a great helm, and with such a narrow sword, no less. With a broader blade, I could maybe imagine cutting into a helmet like this in a thinner area, but this type of helmet is massive and had substantial padding underneath as well. Not to mention a bassinet or a small skull cap style helmet called a cervelier was often worn under the great helm. Well, despite the otherwise highly realistic depictions, this manuscript is apparently about a character from Arthurian legend. So heroic myth is to be expected. It may seem odd to us to combine mythical legend with such realism, but people back then had a different worldview and skepticism didn't fit into it all that well.
We do have to be careful with these images. As said, there's some silly stuff. Some is very poorly drawn to the point where you can barely tell what it's supposed to be. So we need other sources as well. Well, how about surviving armor? Generally, it's hard to find original helmets with verifiable battle damage. There are so many ways in which an artifact can be damaged after the fact. Particularly older iron helmets from the early Middle Ages or even before are often heavily corroded, and it's very difficult to determine what happened when. Some were even intentionally destroyed at the time to be deposited as votive offerings to the gods or who knows what. And when you look at museums have a tendency to display the most impressive, well-preserved pieces. So you're generally not going to find a whole lot of battle damage. In the 16th and 17th century, it's easier to find damage in the form of indentations from gunfire, often done deliberately to test the armor after it was made. In earlier times, you might see holes from war picks or other polearms. Slashes, though, not so much. However, I found a fascinating example of a bronze helmet, about 2,200 to 2,400 years old, with very obvious damage from a strike with a long blade, likely a sword. So we see here that it caved it in quite a bit. You can see the line that the blade made, but it didn't go all the way through.
Here's another interesting example, a Celtic bronze helmet from the 5th century BC. Doesn't seem like it was a pleasant experience for the wearer. This looks like damage from an axe though, not a sword.
Of course, whether a sword or any weapon really is capable of splitting a helmet depends on the helmet and the weapon. There's plenty of variation depending on where and when you look. Here's an example of a Corinthian helmet made of bronze. There are no measurements given, but you can see how the nasal, the eye openings and the forehead are reinforced and the rest is thinner. So they saved where they could, which pays off because this helmet weighs less than 1 kilogram, or about 2 pounds. On the opposite end, here's an armet weighing 4.2 kilograms, or 9 pounds. So 4 times as heavy. You get a lot more protection for it, but you gotta lug it around. Whereas this Burgonet would be more comfortable, weighing in at 1.6 kilograms or 3 pounds, 8 ounces. In general, high and late medieval helmets can vary quite a bit, but they're often several millimeters thick. So I can buy the idea that possibly a good steel sword might be able to cut through a thin iron helmet from the early Middle Ages, but when it comes to this kind of stuff, there's absolutely no way. Earlier medieval helmets tended to be thinner than later ones. For example, the Yarm helmet that I covered in detail in another video, linked down below, is between 1.2 and 1.4 millimeters thick. In gauges, that would be between 18 and 17. The same as the thin Norman helmet we tested back in 2016, which as expected didn't protect amazingly well and was dented and battered, but nothing slicing clean through.
No blade cutting its way in, I mean. The beak on the Warhammer, on the other hand, was feeling a little peckish.
Another helmet, 1.5 to 1.7 millimeters thick or 16 gauge, did better but was still damaged quite severely. People like to argue about these kinds of practical tests. When there isn't as much damage as they expect, they tell me, "You didn't hit hard enough, you're too weak." And when I brought someone in who is way stronger and hits like a truck, "Whoa," the response was, "He hit way too hard."
Oh, okay.
But the more common idea is that people back then had mythical strength, far superior to all those wet rag limp noodles walking around nowadays. The way they trained is more conducive to muscular endurance. The way martial artists train now as well. Even if you subscribe to the notion that they were all monstrously strong, there is a limit to how hard you can and want to hit in a fight. If you imagine a medieval battle, if you go all out right away, hit with 100% force as hard as you can every single time, are you going to make it through the entire battle? Think about how much conditioning boxers and MMA fighters, etc. do, who fight unarmored. They go for minutes at a time with short breaks in between, and even they have to pace themselves, throwing full-powered blows one after the other over and over again. Just wouldn't be very sustainable, and also wouldn't be smart, because what happens when you really lay into it and you give it your all and you miss or the target evades? The harder you commit, the harder the counter. So it might be smarter to hold back a little bit and fight with more control and recover better.
In case of a sword, there's another limiting factor: how much damage it can take. The edge might be bent, chipped, or even gouged out, and the blade or tang may bend or break. When Sean Franklin struck that helmet, he did so with controlled force, without overswinging, throwing himself off balance, and exposing himself. Even so, it was enough power to damage the falx, which is quite a robust design and well made with a thick spine.
We tested a bassinet that was 2.2 to 2.5 millimeters thick, which is 14 to 13 gauge, and that thing was basically indestructible as far as the things we attempted. Now, that is a simplification because modern reproductions are made of uniform steel, whereas back in the day, they had different thicknesses depending on where exactly. Like the forehead might be thicker, the sides thinner, things like that. So where you hit very much matters. If we look at a Spangenhelm, for example, which consists of bands of iron that form the frame and then pieces in between that fill the gaps. And areas where the iron bands overlap are exceptionally strong. You can have thicknesses of 8 millimeters up to 26 millimeters. The source is linked down below as well, by the way. The material in between the frame is much thinner and thereby more vulnerable. Swords or other weapons with a certain impact area can't really exploit that because they're always going to hit the frame as well. It's pretty difficult to target just those sections in between. You would need something like a hammer or a pick or an axe with a short edge. There are very impressive examples of helmet cutting though, Kabutowari as it's called in Japanese. There's a famous test from 1987 where a blade actually managed to cut into and through the helmet. And also a test on Adam Chaladin's channel with a very similar result. It looks like the blade didn't go far enough to actually reach past the padding and cut into the wearer's head necessarily. Now this would still be a debilitating attack, definitely concussion time, at least possible skull fracture, just from the sheer impact. One thing some people criticized in my helmet test from 2016 is that the helmet was set up a little bit lower than head height. And the lower it is, of course, the more you can lay into it, the more rotation there is, the more velocity you can generate and put your body weight into it. Those helmet tests, on the other hand, are lower than a kneeling man. That's perhaps somebody clipping into the floor or maybe standing in a hole like in Talhofer's man versus woman setup. But as said, there is plenty of exaggeration, and you don't need Captain Obvious to tell you how much exaggeration is in this bullshit. Splitting the helmet and the head inside 3/4 of the way.
Right, yeah, of course.
Of course, there's a difference between hitting a stationary target and an unwilling opponent who's trying to evade, maybe head movement, things like that. It can also go in the opposite direction. If you hit somebody who moves into the blow, it would be amplified. But it's typically more likely that they might try to move away from it and absorb a little bit or turn slightly so that the helmet deflects rather than take on the full impact. There's a common sense argument of, if armor had been so easy to just cut right through, would they have bothered? Because there was a lot of work involved in making it. It was expensive. It was inconvenient. And when we look at the manuscripts, we see very different methods and tactics when fighting in armor. You have completely different techniques for armor versus unarmored fighting, and those do not consist of just hack 'em real hard. So that all indicates that no, you couldn't just slice straight through. As I said, when it comes to earlier medieval helmets, particularly thin iron helmets, some might seem pointless, but maybe the idea in some cases was it's better to have something to protect yourself against glancing blows or an arrow flying past or shrapnel of some kind or whatever, like some minor injuries that it would protect against, but they wouldn't protect you against full-powered committed strikes. So as usual, it depends. We have to keep that in mind. Things are not as simple. There's plenty of variables. But overall, I'm pretty skeptical. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Hope you found it interesting. Thanks for watching and take care.